Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 36, Episode 2. The remarkable heroics of the Second Anglo-Afghan War, 1878 to 1880. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. Among the many brave acts of the Second Anglo-Afghan War, November 1878 to September 1880, 16 were awarded the Victoria Cross. Among this relatively small collection of awards, however, are several remarkable circumstances. The war saw the last Victoria Cross awarded to a civilian, and the same award was the first to a clergyman, Reverend James Adams. Two other awards also saw steps towards recognising men who either died during their brave actions or who died soon thereafter, and so were either dead at the time their award was announced or died before they could receive it. Two other Victoria Cross recipients in the war, Captain John Crook and Lieutenant Walter Hamilton, would die before they could receive their awards, and Hamilton died heroically at the Residency siege in Kabul in September 1879, even before his Victoria Cross was gazetted. Their circumstances began a discussion which led to the granting of posthumous Victoria Crosses from 1902 onwards, the first of which were backdated to the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902. The Second Anglo-Afghan War was part of the wider manoeuvrings of the British Empire and the Russian Empire in the region of Central Asia, Afghanistan, Persia and Tibet, known as the Great Game, during the mid and late 19th century and into the early 20th century. Eventually, a line from the Caspian Sea to the eastern Himalayas saw areas and kingdoms which were dominated by, or the protectorates of, one or the other. The Anglo-Afghan Wars, the first had been fought between 1838 and 1842, and was one of the first conflicts in the Great Game, saw the British Raj based in India come into conflict with the Emirate of Kabul, and then in the Second War the Emirate of Afghanistan under Sher Ali Khan of the Barakzai dynasty. Even though Sher Ali tried to remain neutral between the pressures of both the Russian and British empires, the final pretext for war with Britain was his refusal to allow a permanent British envoy to take up residence in Kabul in 1878. The Afghans refused to allow the embassy, led by General Neville Bowles-Chamberlain, passage through the Khyber Pass. This refusal looked to the British as if Sher Ali was definitively siding with the Russians. Prior to that, he had accepted aid from both empires and had begun to modernise not only the Afghan military, but the administration of the country as well. Actually, Sher Ali was not siding with the Russians, and it was the British march on Kabul from India in November 1878 which almost finally forced his hand to seek out-and-out Russian support. The British took the supposed affront to Chamberlain to launch an attack on the fortress of Ali Masjid, located at the narrowest point of the Khyber Pass on November 21st, 1878. The British and British Indian troops were organised into three columns. The largest was the Peshawar Valley Field Force, the others were the Kurram Valley Field Force and the Kandahar Field Force. The 3,800 British troops of the Peshawar Valley Field Force, led by Lieutenant General Sir Samuel James Brown, attacked the fortress, 1,900 frontally and 1,700 led around by night in a flanking attack. The men were disorganised and hampered by poor equipment and insufficient water, and some got lost, but lucky for them the Afghans quickly abandoned their positions. This was despite the fact that the defenders had more men, some 4,100, the fortress and 24 cannon in position, but they had only round shot, not the artillery shells which the British guns could bring to bear. The British launched their attack in the morning, and by the evening were within storming distance of the fort. The Afghans abandoned the fort during the night. The British suffered 16 killed and 34 wounded, while the Afghans suffered 40 wounded and 300 captured, as well as the loss of 21 guns. The capturing of the fort meant the northern approach to Kabul was almost entirely undefended. Brown reached Jalalabad and camped there for the winter. Meanwhile, the Kurram Valley force of 3,000 men with 13 guns invaded via the Kurram Valley on the same day as the assault on Ali Masjid. The British column headed towards Kabul along the Paiwar Kotal Pass. The Afghans, numbering some 5,000 men, regulars and tribesmen, with 25 guns, had taken up what seemed to be an impregnable position overlooking the pass. The British commander, Major General Frederick Roberts, camped outside Afghan artillery range and reconnoitred the enemy's position for several days. On December the 1st he ordered preparations for a frontal assault, but during the night he led the main part of his force around to attack the Afghan flank. This assault, led by the 72nd Seaforth Highlanders and the 5th Gurkha Rifles, was launched at dawn on the morning of December the 7th, and Roberts's manoeuvre took the Afghans completely by surprise. They seized several strategic points without sustaining noticeable losses, and the Afghans, suffering several hundred casualties, retreated from the battlefield. The British suffered 21 killed and 72 wounded. Captain John Cook of the 5th Gurkha Rifles was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously for his part in leading a group of men to prevent the Afghans from rescuing one of their guns. With only 15 or 20 men, he engaged with 200 Afghans who had at first been mistaken for friendly sepoys, and so got within 50 yards of the British position. Cook then saw that the enemy had a mountain gun with them. He charged out of the entrenchment with such impetuosity that the enemy broke and fled, leaving many of their men and 3 battery mules on the ground. He then went on to assist the Assistant Adjutant General of the force, Major Galbraith, who was in a desperate personal conflict with an Afghan soldier, according to the Major's letter sent by Roberts recommending him for the Victoria Cross, and included in the subsequent Gazette entry. Cook grappled with the enemy, a most powerful man, and despite being bitten in the frantic hand-to-hand combat, he eventually prevailed. His action was described as single act of valour. This was the first of 16 Victoria Crosses awarded during the Second Anglo-Afghan War. The award was posthumous because Cook would die later in the campaign, in December 1879, after his award had been gazetted, though he had not received his medal. Major Galbraith recommended Cook for the award in a letter to his Commander-in-Chief, General Roberts, written soon after, on December 5th, only 3 days after the action, providing details of Cook's bravery. Galbraith surmised the whole affair was the work of a moment, but I feel convinced that but for Captain Cook's prompt endeavour to draw the man's fire upon himself, I should, in all probability, have been shot before I could have again discharged my pistol. Several others of the enemy were at the time within a few yards of us. Roberts's handling of his attack was far more successful than Brown's had been at Ali Masjid, and the dissemination of the news of his success by war photographer John Burke, among others, who accompanied him, made him the new celebrity of the war and one of the most successful generals of his age. Despite the invasion and defeat, Sher Ali still would not cave to Russian pressure for their military assistance or their advice that he surrender to the British. This suggests that the British casus belli was simply a pretext. Ali Khan died at Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan in February 1879, and his son and successor, Muhammad Yaqub Khan, was forced to immediately sue for peace and to sign the Treaty of Gandamak in May 1879. This saw the ceding of Afghan territory to the British, including northwest frontier provinces and Quetta, and the handing complete control of Afghanistan's foreign affairs to Britain. This ended the first phase of the war, but the treaty and ready capitulation led to a series of rebellions against Yaqub's rule, most seriously that of Ayub Khan in October. Yaqub abdicated, suspected of complicity in the assassination of Sir Pierre Louis Napoleon Gavagnari, thoroughly British despite his name, at Kabul in September 1879. In the aftermath of the treaty, Ayub Khan would renew the War of Maiwand in July 1880, before being decisively defeated at the Battle of Kandahar in September the same year, the last battle of the war. The British then appointed a new emir, Abur Rahman Khan, cousin of Yaqub, who re-ratified the Treaty of Gandamak. Afghanistan would then act as a British-controlled physical buffer between the ambitions of the British and Russian empires, the fate of many states along the line from the Caspian Sea to eastern Himalayas. The British realized the danger of insisting on an envoy presence, and after allowing the Afghan tribes internal rule, they withdrew from the region with no military presence. Diplomatic relations were left to agents of the British Indian government. In response to the initial signing of the Treaty of Gandamak in May 1879, the British sent their newly appointed envoy, Gavagnari, to Kabul. The refusal of an envoy's presence had begun the war the previous year. Gavagnari had been both a negotiator and signatory to the treaty, meaning he was hated by the Afghans. He was also known for having an arrogant disposition, which it was feared might get the British into further difficulties. Nonetheless, Gavagnari was now appointed as the British representative by Governor-General Lord Lytton. He was also knighted and received the Star of India. He arrived in Kabul in July 1879. He took up residence within the Balar Hisar fortress with an assistant, Walter Jenkins, a surgeon, Ambrose Kelly, and a guard of 75 men from the Queen's Own Corps of Guides, 25 sowars of the Guides Cavalry and 50 sepoys of the Guides Infantry, led by Lieutenant Walter Hamilton. This guard may have been kept deliberately small to avoid provoking the Afghan population, although this stands in contrast to the provocative appointment of Gavagnari himself. The residency was only 230 metres from the Emir's chambers. At first, things remained calm, but Afghan reinforcements began to arrive in the city in August, 6 regiments of infantry from Herat in the east. They marched into the fortress and demanded 2 months of arrears in pay. Cavagnari dismissed warnings from a retired Risaldar major of guides with the statements, "Dogs that bark don't bite." And even if the 3 of them, the Residency staff, were killed, their deaths would be avenged. This had been the pattern during the First Anglo-Afghan War in 1842, after the disastrous retreat from Kabul. On September 2nd, 1879, he telegrammed Lord Lytton that all was well at the Kabul embassy. On September 3rd, however, the Herat regiments again assembled within the fortress and demanded their pay. It was suggested that the British had gold with them, and the troops demanded that Cavagnari pay their demands. He refused, saying it was no affair of the British government. This devolved into a fight, and the British Guards fired shots at the Afghan troops. The Afghans, who did not have weapons with them, ran to their cantonment, fetched their weapons, and within an hour 2,000 Afghan troops invaded the Residency. Cavagnari had appealed to Yakub for help, but received no reply. The Residency building was surrounded by taller buildings on 3 sides, giving the Afghan troops advantageous firing positions, and so was impossible to defend. The fire they laid down took a heavy toll on the defenders. Cavagnari was the first to be hit in the head by a musket shot, but, wounded, he still led a bayonet charge to empty the compound of attackers. He then retired inside the Residency and died of his wounds. Command passed to Lieutenant Hamilton, who again sent to the Amir for assistance. This time help was sent, including the Amir's son, to try and calm the situation, but they were driven off by stones thrown at the party. The Residency was then set on fire, and by midday only 30 defenders remained able to keep fighting. 2 cannon were brought and began firing point blank into the Residency building. A last messenger was sent to the Emir, who replied that he was powerless to help. Hamilton led a bayonet charge which captured one of the guns, but this was driven off again by enemy fire. During the charge, the surgeon Kelly and 6 of the remaining sepoys were killed. Cavagnari's assistant, Secretary Jenkins, was then killed, and Hamilton was forced to retire to the solidly built bathhouse with his 20 remaining sepoys. From there he led another charge at the guns and stood his ground as Afghans countercharged, emptying his revolver into the enemy, memorably depicted in a statue now in the National Army Museum, London. Hamilton was overwhelmed and killed, but his stand had allowed his remaining men to reach the bathhouse. The few remaining men, who were now without British officers, refused to surrender, and in a final charge they took as many enemy as they could before all being killed. The most senior man was Jemadar Jawand Singh. He killed 8 Afghans in his final charge before he was cut down. The whole siege had lasted 8 hours. Of the garrison of 4 British officers and 75 troops, only 7 men survived, the 3 sent as messengers to the Emir, and 4 who happened to be away from the Residency that morning. Native members of the British Indian Army were not eligible to receive the Victoria Cross, and would not be until 1911, with the first medals awarded during the First World War in December 1914. But the entire escort received the Indian Order of Merit, the award in place for recognizing the bravery of native soldiers of any rank since 1837. The Corps of Guides was also awarded the Battle of Honor, Residency Kabul. When news broke of what had happened at Kabul, there was outrage. General Frederick Roberts quickly raised the Kabul field force This was the Kurram Valley Field Force of 1878, reinforced and redesignated, consisting of 7,500 men and with 20 field guns of the British and the British Indian armies to reinforce the small garrison in the Kurram Valley. They then marched on Kabul, crossing the Shtagarden Pass into central Afghanistan. On October the 6th, 1879, they defeated an Afghan force at Karasiab and occupied Kabul on October the 12th. Yaqub surrendered to Roberts and then later abdicated, implicated by his perceived lack of action in the Residency siege. Roberts then held a military court which tried and executed 100 Afghans for their part in the attack on the Residency. This action was controversial and understandably unpopular. Reinforcements continued to be raised, and the size of Roberts's force eventually rose to 14,000 men. Resistance also continued, and in November a group of 10,000 Afghans assembled north of Kabul. They, however, considered that Ayub Khan, the new emir since October after Yaqub's abdication, was a British puppet, and so were acting independently from other resistance to the British. Led by Muhammad Jan Khan Wardak, they declared their own emir, Musa Jan. On December 11th, 1879, this force of 10,000 Afghans marched towards Kabul and encountered a small detachment of only about 170 British cavalry, made up of men of the 9th Queen's Royal Lancers and the 14th Bengal Lancers. Despite their being so massively outnumbered, the Lancers charged the Afghans in an attempt to delay their advance on Kabul. The Lancers predictably had to fall back. At the village of Kilakazi, a group of Lancers fell into a nullah, a wide and deep water-filled ditch, their horses falling on top of the men and trapping them there. With the enemy approaching, Reverend James Adams, attached to the Bengal Ecclesiastical Department and serving as a chaplain to the Kabul field force, jumped from his horse and waded into the waist-deep water. Under heavy enemy fire, Adams helped the Lancers extricate themselves from under their horses and then to escape. Adams was the last to escape on foot, as the enemy was almost upon him, and who were only held off by fire from the rescued Lancers. The campaign continued, and the Afghan force put the Sherpa cantonment in Kabul under siege on December 15th. This was the military quarters of the 7,000 British and British Indian forces from a variety of regiments present in Kabul. News of the renewed violence had quickly spread, and a new column was raised under command of Brigadier General Charles Gough, who had received a Victoria Cross for his actions at the siege of Lucknow and elsewhere in India between 1857 and 1858. A brigade commander with the Peshawar Valley Field Force in the Khyber Pass. News of this expected relief reached Muhammad Jan, and he ordered the cantonment stormed on December 23rd. Because of his success to that point, Muhammad Jan's forces may have swelled to as many as 50,000 men. These stormed the cantonment on December 23rd, but were successfully repulsed. The British and British Indian forces suffering only 33 casualties, whilst killing approximately 3,000 Afghans. The most notable of the British casualties was that of now Major John Cook. He had fallen back to the cantonment on December 11th, fighting a rearguard action and saving the 1st Brigade's baggage. In the heat of his action, he led a bayonet charge in company with his younger brother, Lieutenant Walter Cook, 3rd Sikhs. The ferocity of their charge dispersed the Afghans, but Walter Cook was wounded in the chest and John was wounded in the head. He nonetheless participated in an attack on the high ground around Kabul on December 12th, but was shot in the leg, shattering the bone, and he died of his wounds on December 19th. Although gazetted for his action the previous year, Cook had not yet received his Victoria Cross. Lieutenant Hamilton was awarded a Victoria Cross for an action at Fattahabad in April 1879, although the approval actually only came after his death on September 28th. However, the date of the approval was backdated to September 1st to make it appear as though it predated his death on September 3rd. The Gazette entry only appeared on October 7th, 1879. The circumstances of Hamilton and Cook's actions were further steps towards the recognition of posthumous valour. Up to this time, 12 recipients of the Victoria Cross had died by the time they were recommended for or due to receive their awards. However, the first truly posthumous Victoria Crosses, when the recipient died in the act of their bravery, or soon after, or indeed when their subsequent death would not be considered a barrier to consideration, would not actually come until the aftermath of the Second Boer War in 1902, when the royal warrant was once again changed to allow the awarding of posthumous Victoria Crosses, the first being awarded to Captain David Younger, who had died at Krugersdorp, South Africa, on July the 11th, 1900. It was now Lord Roberts who recommended that Reverend Adams be awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions. For Adams to be awarded the Victoria Cross, however, another amendment to the royal warrant for the medal was necessary, since he was a civilian and a member of the clergy, even if attached to an army regiment. The history of the Victoria Cross has seen the medal invested upon 5 civilians. The outstanding bravery of 4 civilians during the Indian Mutiny in 1857 and 1858 were the first recognised. Adams would be the last civilian to date to receive the award, and the first member of the clergy. To award a Victoria Cross to a member of an ecclesiastical department required an amendment to the royal warrant for the Victoria Cross so that ecclesiastical members were eligible if serving under military orders, as Adams had been. As such, the London Gazette of August 24th, 1881, published on the 26th, announced that the Victoria Cross warrant had been extended to members of the Indian ecclesiastical establishments who were serving under orders in the field. This opened the way for Adams to be gazetted. Later in the same issue, he had been married the week before. This, and he received his medal from Queen Victoria at Buckingham Palace on December 1st, 1881. He would continue to serve, accompanying Roberts once more in 1885 to Burma. He then became the honorary chaplain to the Prince of Wales in 1900, and thereafter became the honorary chaplain to the King in July 1901, and soon after one of the 12 chaplains in ordinary to the King, part of the King's ecclesiastical household. He died in 1903 and remains one of only 3 chaplains to have been awarded the Victoria Cross, the others being William Addison in Mesopotamia in 1916, and Canadian John Foote in the Second World War during the Dieppe raid in 1942. Soon after the inauguration of the Victoria Cross in 1857, other awards for bravery were instituted, several of them available to civilians. In 1866 the Albert Medal for life-saving was introduced. The first recipient of the Albert Medal was a civilian, Samuel Popplestone, a tenant farmer from Devon, who rescued survivors of the cargo ship Spirit of the Queen, which had run aground. The Albert Medal was originally intended for saving a life at sea, although in 1877 a saving life on land category was introduced after the Tynwyd colliery disaster in April 1877. Mining accidents were routine and often claimed lives. At Tynwyd, however, the determined rescue efforts to save the trapped miners and the media attention which followed led to the creation of the Albert Medal for gallantry on land. In 1907, the Edward Medal, to be awarded specifically for acts of bravery of miners, was instituted. The Distinguished Service Order was instituted in 1886 for military acts of bravery which did not reach the standard required for the Victoria Cross, although initially this was reserved only for officers. Other military orders followed. There were also moves to recognise civilian valour. Other medals, the British Empire Medal and the Empire Gallantry Medal, were introduced by King George V in December 1922 for those acts of gallantry which did not reach the standard required for either the Albert Medal or the Edward Medal. The George Cross itself was instituted in September 1940 for acts of the greatest heroism or for most conspicuous courage in circumstances of extreme danger, open to members of the armed forces and civilians, and not requiring those acts to be in the presence of an enemy. The Empire Gallantry Medal, awarded 130 times, was immediately superseded by the George Cross, although the Albert Medal, awarded a total of 568 times, and the Edward Medal, awarded 583 times, were discontinued and replaced by the George Cross in 1971. The British Empire Medal for meritorious civil or military service remains in place to this day. Civilians remain eligible for the Victoria Cross in the right circumstances, but the last awarded was to Adams, marking his and several other Victoria Crosses awarded during the Second Anglo-Afghan War worthy of special consideration. Thanks once again, Murray, for writing that episode for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.